David Thompson checked his watch for the third time in 2 minutes as he hurried through the crowded airport terminal. The digital display showed 2:47 p.m., and his flight to Seattle was scheduled to board at 3:15 p.m. He had exactly 28 minutes to get through security and reach gate C12, which according to the airport map was all the way at the other end of the terminal. His phone buzzed with another text from his assistant. Investors confirmed for 9 a.m. tomorrow. They're excited to see the presentation. Don't miss this flight. David smiled despite his stress. After 8 years of building his tech company from nothing, this meeting could change everything. His software helped businesses track their deliveries and cut shipping costs by up to 30%. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it could save companies millions of dollars every year. The problem was convincing people to believe in him. Being a young black entrepreneur in the tech world had never been easy. David had lost count of how many times he'd walked into meetings where people seemed surprised that he was the CEO they were expecting. He'd learned to dress impeccably, speak with perfect confidence, and always be twice as prepared as anyone else in the room. Today's presentation was the biggest opportunity his company had ever received. The investors in Seattle weren't just offering money, they were offering connections, credibility, and a chance to compete with the big players in the logistics software industry. David had spent the last 3 weeks perfecting his presentation. Every slide was polished, every number double-checked, every potential question anticipated. His laptop bag contained backup drives, printed materials, and even a second laptop in case something went wrong. He couldn't afford any mistakes. The security line moved slower than he hoped. Business travelers stood impatiently with their carry-on bags, checking phones and looking at their watches. David found himself behind a family with 3 young children, who seemed to need extra time for everything. The parents looked stressed as they juggled car seats, diaper bags, and trying to keep their kids calm. Come on," David muttered under his breath, then immediately felt guilty. These people were just trying to travel with their family. Everyone had somewhere important to be. When he finally reached the security checkpoint, David quickly removed his laptop, shoes, and belt. He'd done this routine hundreds of times during his years of traveling to pitch his company to potential clients. The metal detector beeped, and the security officer asked him to step aside for additional screening. Really? David thought. But he cooperated politely. He knew that arguing or showing frustration would only make things take longer. The additional screening took 5 minutes that he didn't have. By the time David collected his belongings and put his shoes back on, his watch showed 3:02 p.m. He had 13 minutes to reach a gate that was at least a 10-minute walk away. He started jogging through the terminal, weaving between slower passengers and pulling his carry-on bag behind him. The terminal was busier than usual. Delayed flights had created crowds of frustrated travelers, and several gates had long lines of people waiting to reboard. David passed a coffee shop where the line stretched into the walkway, a bookstore with a sale that had attracted browsers, and a restaurant where people sat with their luggage, eating quick meals before their flights. As he jogged, David thought about how much this moment represented. His company, Thompson Logistics Solutions, had started in his apartment with just him and an old computer. He'd maxed out his credit cards, borrowed money from family, and worked 18-hour days for years. There had been times when he wasn't sure he could pay his rent, let alone grow a business. But slowly, things had started to work. Small companies began using his software and seeing real results. Word spread and bigger clients started calling. David hired his first employee, then his second, then his 10th. They moved into a real office space. They developed new features and improved their technology. Now they had 23 employees and clients in 12 states. But David knew they needed this next level of investment to really compete. The big logistics companies had unlimited resources and established relationships. David's company was still small enough that losing one major client could put them in serious trouble. The investors in Seattle represented security, growth, and validation. They had specifically requested to meet with David after hearing about his company's success with a major shipping company that had cut their delivery costs by 28% using his software. David's phone rang as he reached the halfway point to his gate. It was his business partner and best friend Tony calling from their office. "Are you on the plane yet?" Tony asked. "Almost at the gate," David said, slightly out of breath from jogging. "5 more minutes." "Good. I just wanted to remind you that the Peterson account numbers are in the blue folder, and if they ask about the Chicago implementation, emphasize the cost savings, not the timeline challenges we had." "Got it," David said. "I've been over this presentation 100 times. I'm ready." "I know you are. This is going to be great. Call me as soon as you land." David ended the call and picked up his pace. 3 minutes to boarding and he could see gate C12 ahead. There was still a line of passengers waiting to board, which meant he hadn't missed it completely. But as he got closer, David noticed something that made his heart sink. An elderly woman was standing near the check-in counter, looking confused and distressed. She had 2 large suitcases that appeared to be too heavy for her to manage, and she kept looking around as if searching for help. The gate agents were busy processing passengers, and other travelers were focused on their own boarding process. Nobody seemed to notice that this woman needed assistance. David slowed his jog to a walk, then stopped completely. He looked at his watch. 3:12 p.m. 3 minutes until boarding. He looked at the gate where passengers were still in line. He looked back at the elderly woman, who was now struggling to lift one of her suitcases. Everything David had worked for was waiting at that gate. 8 years of building his company, 3 weeks of preparing for this presentation, and the financial future of his business and his employees all depended on getting on that flight. But he couldn't walk past someone who clearly needed help. David had been raised by a grandmother who always told him that success meant nothing if you forgot to be human along the way. She'd worked 2 jobs to help pay for his college education, and had always emphasized that kindness was more important than money. "A person's character," she used to say, "shows up most clearly when no one is watching and nothing is expected in return." David took a deep breath, looked once more at his gate, and walked toward the elderly woman with her heavy luggage. "Excuse me," he said with a gentle smile. "It looks like you might need some help with those bags." The elderly woman looked up at David with tired but grateful eyes. She was probably in her late 70s, well-dressed in a navy blue suit that spoke of old-fashioned elegance. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, but her face showed the kind of exhaustion that comes from traveling when your body isn't as strong as it used to be. "Oh, thank you, dear," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I don't know what I was thinking packing so much. These bags seem to get heavier every year." David glanced quickly at his watch. 3:13 p.m. 2 minutes until boarding. He could hear the gate agent's voice over the intercom beginning the boarding process for first-class passengers. But the woman in front of him looked genuinely distressed, and he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "No problem at all," David said, reaching for the handle of her largest suitcase. "Where are you trying to go?" The woman fumbled with her purse, pulling out a crumpled boarding pass. "I'm supposed to be on a flight to Portland. My sister is in the hospital there, and I need to get to her as soon as possible. But I can't seem to find the right gate, and these bags—" She trailed off, looking overwhelmed. David's heart sank a little deeper. This wasn't just someone who needed help with heavy luggage. This was someone dealing with a family emergency, trying to get to a loved one who might be seriously ill. He couldn't possibly walk away now. "Let me help you find your gate," David said, taking control of both her suitcases. "What's your flight number?" The woman squinted at her boarding pass. "Flight 447 to Portland. It says gate B18. But I've been walking around for 20 minutes and I can't find it anywhere. Everything looks the same in here." David knew exactly where gate B18 was. It was in the opposite direction from his own gate, about a 15-minute walk through the terminal. He looked toward gate C12, where he could see the line of passengers boarding his flight getting shorter by the minute. "Ma'am, gate B18 is in Terminal B," David explained gently. "You're in Terminal C right now. We need to take the shuttle train to get there." The woman's face fell. "Oh no. I knew I should have asked for help earlier. I'm not good with these big airports. My late husband always handled our travel arrangements." Her voice caught slightly when she mentioned her husband. Behind them, David heard the gate agent announce, "Now boarding Group 2 for Flight 891 to Seattle." His group, his flight, his future. David closed his eyes for just a moment, thinking about everything that was at stake. The presentation he'd worked on for weeks. The investors who were expecting him. The employees who were counting on this deal. Tony would be checking his phone constantly, waiting for confirmation that David had made the flight. But when he opened his eyes and saw this woman's worried face, the choice became clear. "Don't worry," David said, mustering his most reassuring smile. "We'll get you to your gate with plenty of time. When does your flight leave?" 4:30, she replied, checking her boarding pass again. David felt a small surge of relief. That gave them over an hour, which should be plenty of time even with the shuttle ride to Terminal B. At least he could help her without making her miss her flight too. "I'm David, by the way," he said as he began pulling her suitcases toward the shuttle station. "I'm Dorothy," she replied, walking beside him at a slower pace than he was used to. "You're very kind to help me. Most people seem so busy in airports these days." As they walked, David heard the final boarding announcement for his flight. Final call for Flight 891 to Seattle, now boarding all remaining passengers at Gate C12. Dorothy must have heard it too because she suddenly stopped walking. "Oh my goodness, is that your flight? Are you missing your flight to help me?" David paused. He could still make it if he ran. The gate wasn't that far away, and sometimes flights left a few minutes late. He could abandon Dorothy's luggage right here, apologize quickly, and sprint back to his gate. There might still be time. "Don't worry about me," David said instead. "Let's focus on getting you to your sister." They continued toward the shuttle station, and David tried not to think about his phone, which was probably buzzing with messages from Tony wondering where he was. The shuttle arrived just as they reached the platform, and David helped Dorothy and her luggage into the car. During the short ride to Terminal B, Dorothy began to share more about her situation. Her sister had fallen at home and broken her hip. At 82 years old, it was a serious injury that would require surgery and a long recovery. "We're all the family each other has left," Dorothy explained. "Our children live far away and they can't get there until tomorrow. I couldn't stand the thought of her being alone in the hospital tonight." David found himself genuinely moved by her story. Here was someone who was probably uncomfortable traveling alone, dealing with heavy luggage and confusing airports, but doing it anyway because family mattered more than her own comfort. "That's really admirable," David said. "Your sister is lucky to have you." Dorothy smiled sadly. "We've been through everything together, lost our husbands within 2 years of each other, helped each other through raising children as single mothers, celebrated every grandchild's birth. She would do the same for me without question." When they reached Terminal B, David helped Dorothy off the shuttle and began navigating toward Gate B18. The terminal was less crowded here and the walk was easier. Dorothy moved slowly but steadily, and David found himself adjusting his usual fast pace to match hers. "You know," Dorothy said as they walked, "you remind me of my late husband. He never could walk past someone who needed help. Used to drive me crazy sometimes, how he'd stop to help strangers change flat tires or carry groceries. But I was proud of him for it too." David thought about his grandmother's words again. Character shows up when no one is watching and nothing is expected in return. Except people were watching, in a way. Dorothy was watching. His grandmother, if she were still alive, would be watching. And somehow David was watching himself too, seeing what kind of person he really was when it mattered. They reached Gate B18 with 45 minutes to spare before Dorothy's flight. David helped her check in with the gate agent who confirmed that her seat was ready and her flight was on time. He carried her bags to a comfortable seat in the waiting area and made sure she had water and knew where the restrooms were located. "I don't know how to thank you," Dorothy said, settling into her seat with visible relief. "You've been so kind. Most people would have just walked by." "I'm just glad I could help," David replied. "I hope everything goes well with your sister's surgery." Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "I want you to have this," she said, "if you're ever in the Portland area, or if there's anything I can ever do for you, please don't hesitate to call. David took the card politely, barely glancing at it before slipping it into his pocket. His mind was already shifting to the reality of what he'd just done. He'd missed his flight. The presentation was tomorrow morning, and the next flight to Seattle wouldn't get him there in time. 8 years of work, the future of his company, 23 employees who were counting on him, all for a stranger he'd never see again. As David Bowie walked back toward the shuttle to return to Terminal C, he pulled out his phone to call Tony. This was going to be a very difficult conversation. David stared at his phone screen, trying to find the courage to call Tony. The shuttle back to Terminal C felt like it was moving in slow motion, even though it was probably the same speed as before. Everything felt different now that he knew his flight was gone. When he finally reached Gate C12, it was empty, except for a few airport workers cleaning up. The departure board confirmed what he already knew. Flight 891 to Seattle had departed, on time at 3:30 p.m. David walked up to the gate counter where a tired-looking agent was sorting through paperwork. "Excuse me," David said. "I missed Flight 891 to Seattle. When is the next available flight?" The agent looked up with the expression of someone who'd answered this question many times that day. She typed something into her computer and frowned at the screen. "Let me check what we have," she said. "Seattle is a popular route, so, okay, the next flight with available seats is tomorrow evening at 6:45 p.m. That would get you there around 9:30 p.m. local time." David's heart sank. Tomorrow evening meant he'd miss the morning presentation entirely. There was no way to reschedule with the investors. They were flying back to New York tomorrow afternoon, and this was the only window they had available for the next 3 months. "Is there anything earlier?" David asked, though he could already see the answer in the agent's expression. "I'm sorry, but everything else is completely booked. There was a weather delay in Chicago that backed everything up. We have a waiting list for the 7 a.m. flight tomorrow, but there are already 43 people ahead of you." David thanked the agent and walked away from the counter, feeling numb. He found an empty chair in the waiting area and finally made the call he'd been dreading. Tony answered on the first ring. "Please tell me you're in the air right now." "I'm not," David said quietly. "I missed the flight." There was a long silence. On the other end, David could practically hear Tony trying to process this information. "What do you mean you missed the flight? You were at the gate. You texted me 20 minutes ago saying you were almost there." David took a deep breath and explained what had happened. About Dorothy and her heavy luggage, about her sister in the hospital, about the wrong terminal and the shuttle ride and making sure she got to her gate safely. When he finished, Tony was quiet for another long moment. "Let me get this straight," Tony finally said. "You missed the biggest meeting in our company's history to help a random stranger with her luggage?" "It wasn't just luggage, Tony. She was trying to get to her sister who's in the hospital. She was completely lost and overwhelmed. David, there are airport employees whose job it is to help passengers. There are volunteers in wheelchairs who help elderly people get around. You didn't need to be the one to save the day." David knew Tony was right, at least partially, but he also knew that in that moment when he saw Dorothy struggling, he couldn't have made any other choice. "I know how this looks," David said. "I know what we just lost, but I couldn't walk away from someone who needed help." Tony's voice softened slightly. "I get that you're a good person, David. That's one of the reasons we work so well together. But we have 23 people depending on us. We have clients who trust us. We have bills to pay and a business to run." "I know," David said, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "What do I tell the investors?" "I already called them," Tony said. "I told them you were delayed due to flight cancellations. They can't reschedule. They're flying back to New York tomorrow afternoon, and their next trip to Seattle isn't for another 3 months. David closed his eyes. 3 months might as well be 3 years in the fast-moving world of tech investing. By then, the investors might have found other opportunities, other companies that could deliver presentations on time. "Maybe we can set up a video call," David suggested, though he knew it wasn't the same as an in-person presentation. "I already asked. They said they Prefer to meet face-to-face for initial discussions. Something about reading body language and getting a feel for the person behind the business. David understood that logic. He'd always believed that his best asset was his ability to connect with people in person, to show his passion and commitment through more than just slides and numbers. Now that advantage was gone. After ending the call with Tony, David sat in the airport chair feeling like he'd just watched his dreams fly away to Seattle without him. He thought about all the late nights he'd spent building his company, all the sacrifices he'd made, all the people who had believed in him. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "How did the flight go? Should I confirm your hotel in Seattle?" David stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Flight delayed, we'll update you soon." He couldn't bring himself to explain the whole story again, especially not over text. Instead, he decided to get something to eat and figure out his next steps. The airport felt different now that he wasn't rushing to catch a flight. It was just a large, impersonal building full of strangers going places he wasn't going. David found a quiet restaurant in Terminal C and ordered a sandwich he didn't really want. As he sat there picking at his food, he tried to think of other options. Maybe there was another investor group they could approach. Maybe they could bootstrap for a few more months and try again later. But he knew the truth was more complicated than that. In the competitive world of tech startups, timing was everything. The window for their type of software was open now, but it wouldn't stay that way forever. Bigger companies were starting to develop similar solutions, and they had unlimited resources. David was halfway through his sandwich when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "David? Is that you?" He turned around to see Dorothy approaching his table, pulling her carry-on bag behind her. She looked much more relaxed than she had an hour ago. "Dorothy," David said, standing up. "How are you doing? Is everything okay with your flight?" "Oh, yes. Everything is fine now," she said with a smile. "They delayed my flight by 30 minutes, due to some weather in Portland, but that just gives me more time to rest. I wanted to find you and thank you again for all your help." David gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Would you like to sit down?" "You don't need to thank me again. I was happy to help." Dorothy sat down carefully, settling her purse on the table. "I know you said not to worry about it, but I could tell from the announcements that you missed your own flight. Was it important?" David hesitated. He didn't want to make Dorothy feel guilty for accepting his help, but something about her gentle, grandmother-like presence made him want to be honest. "It was a business meeting," he said simply. "Pretty important, but these things happen." Dorothy studied his face with the kind of sharp attention that reminded David that elderly people had lived through enough experiences to recognize when someone was downplaying their troubles. "It was more than just important, wasn't it?" she said gently. "You have that look my husband used to get when he was trying to protect me from bad news." David found himself smiling despite everything. "You're very perceptive." 83 years of practice, Dorothy said. "Now tell me what you really missed and don't try to spare my feelings. I'm tougher than I look." David looked at Dorothy's kind but determined face and realized she wasn't going to let him brush this off. There was something about her that reminded him of his grandmother. That same ability to see right through polite deflection to the heart of what was really bothering someone. "All right," David said, settling back in his chair. "The meeting I missed was with a group of investors who could have changed everything for my company. I've been working on this business for 8 years, and this was our biggest opportunity yet." Dorothy listened without interrupting as David explained about his logistics software company, the months of preparation for this presentation, and how missing this meeting might mean missing their chance to compete with the larger companies in their field. "We have 23 employees who are counting on this deal," David said. "And now I have to go back and tell them that I chose to help a stranger instead of securing their futures." When he finished, Dorothy was quiet for a moment, her hands folded on the table. David expected her to apologize or express regret that her situation had caused him so much trouble. Instead, she surprised him. "Tell me about your software," she said. "What exactly does it do?" David blinked, not expecting this response. "Well, it helps companies track their shipments and optimize their delivery routes. Most businesses lose a lot of money because they can't see where inefficiencies are happening in their supply chain. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully. And how much money can companies save? It depends on their size, but we've had clients cut their shipping costs by anywhere from 15 to 35%. Our biggest success story saved about $2 million in the first year alone. That's remarkable, Dorothy said, and David could tell she genuinely meant it. How did you get into this type of work? David found himself relaxing as he talked about something he was passionate about. I used to work for a shipping company right out of college. I noticed that we were wasting so much time and money on routes that didn't make sense, sending trucks half empty, or shipping things the long way around when there were better options. But nobody had good visibility into the data to fix it. So, you decided to create that visibility yourself, Dorothy said. Exactly. I started working on it nights and weekends, just trying to solve the problems I saw every day. When I finally had something that worked, I quit my job and started the company in my apartment. Dorothy smiled. That takes courage. Starting a business is never easy, especially when you're young. It's been harder than I expected, David admitted. Not just the technical challenges, but convincing people to trust a small company with their logistics when there are huge corporations offering similar services. But your results speak for themselves, Dorothy pointed out. Saving companies millions of dollars isn't something you can fake. David appreciated her confidence, but he couldn't shake his frustration about the missed opportunity. The problem is, results don't matter if you can't get in front of the right people to show them. Today was supposed to be our chance to do that. Dorothy was quiet again, and David could see her thinking about something. When she finally spoke, her question surprised him. David, can I ask you something personal? Why did you stop to help me today? You knew how important your meeting was. You knew you were cutting it close with time. What made you choose to help? A stranger instead? David considered the question seriously. I guess I was raised to believe that how you treat people matters more than what you achieve. My grandmother always said that success without character is just empty accomplishment. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She worked 2 jobs to help pay for my college, and she never let me forget that education was a privilege, not a right. She wanted me to use whatever opportunities I got to help other people, not just myself. Dorothy nodded slowly. And today, when you had to choose between a business opportunity and helping someone in need, you chose to help. Yes, but now I'm wondering if that was the right choice. My grandmother also taught me about responsibility to the people who depend on you. She sounds like someone who understood that life is rarely about simple choices between right and wrong, Dorothy said. Usually it's about choosing between 2 different kinds of right. David had never thought about it that way before, but it made sense. There was nothing wrong with pursuing business success to provide for his employees and grow his company. There was also nothing wrong with helping someone who needed assistance. The problem was when those 2 values came into conflict. Can I tell you something about my own business experience? Dorothy asked. David nodded, curious to hear her perspective. I've been involved in business for over 40 years, Dorothy said. I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs come and go, and I've learned that the most successful ones aren't necessarily the smartest or the most ruthless. They're the ones who understand that business is fundamentally about relationships and trust. That makes sense, David said, though he wasn't sure where she was going with this. The investors you were supposed to meet today, do you think they would have been impressed by your presentation? I hope so. I spent weeks preparing it, and our results are solid. I'm sure they would have been, Dorothy said. But presentations can be rescheduled. What can't be replicated is character. The fact that you chose to help me today tells me more about the kind of person you are than any slide deck could. David appreciated her perspective, but he couldn't help feeling that character didn't pay the bills or keep his company competitive. I understand what you're saying, David said. But in the business world, good intentions don't always translate to success. Sometimes you have to be ruthless to survive. Dorothy smiled. I used to think that too when I was younger, but I've learned that ruthless people might win in the short term, but they rarely build anything that lasts. The businesses that endure are built on trust, integrity, and genuine relationships. Have you been in business yourself? David asked. Oh yes, Dorothy said. My late husband and I started a small company many years ago. We made a lot of mistakes in the beginning, but we learned that treating people right was always the best long-term strategy. David was curious about what kind of business they'd run, but before he could ask, the gate agent's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now ready to begin boarding Flight 447 to Portland. We'll start with our first class. Passengers and anyone needing special assistance. Dorothy began gathering her things. That's my flight, she said. David, I want you to know that meeting you today has been a bright spot in what could have been a very difficult day. Your kindness meant more to me than you'll ever know. She stood up slowly, and David rose to help her with her carry-on bag. I hope everything goes well with your sister, David said. Thank you, and I hope things work out with your business. I have a feeling they will. Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, the same one she'd given him earlier. I meant what I said about calling me if you're ever in Portland, or if there's anything I can ever do to help your company. David took the card again, this time glancing at it briefly. It seemed to be for some kind of consulting business, though he didn't look closely enough to read the details. I appreciate that, David said. Take care of yourself, Dorothy. As he watched her walk toward the gate, David felt a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction. He'd missed the biggest opportunity of his career, but he'd also discovered something about himself that he hadn't known before. When faced with a choice between self-interest and helping others, he'd chosen to help. His grandmother would have been proud. Now he just had to figure out how to explain that to his 23 employees. The next morning, David sat in his hotel room staring at his laptop screen. He'd spent most of the night trying to salvage something from this trip, reaching out to other potential investors and exploring backup options, but every lead seemed to hit a dead end. His phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from Tony and team members asking for updates. David had been putting off the difficult conversation about what came next for the company. He knew he had to call Tony soon, but he wasn't ready to face that reality yet. Instead, he found himself thinking about his conversation with Dorothy. There had been something almost magical about talking to someone who understood business challenges, but wasn't directly affected by his company's struggles. Her perspective on character and relationships had given him a lot to think about. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Dorothy's business card. He'd been carrying it around since yesterday, but hadn't really looked at it closely. This time he decided to read it properly. The card was simple and elegant, with embossed lettering on thick, expensive cardstock. As David read the text, his coffee mug slipped from his hand and crashed to the floor. Dorothy Heritage, Chairman and Owner, Heritage Airlines. David stared at the card, reading it 3 times to make sure he wasn't imagining things. Heritage Airlines, the same airline he'd flown on dozens of times. The same airline whose logo was printed on his boarding pass from yesterday's missed flight. The elderly woman he'd helped with her luggage wasn't just someone with business experience. She was the owner of a major airline company. David's mind raced as he thought back through their conversations. She'd mentioned that her husband had started a small company many years ago. She'd talked about being involved in business for 40 years. She'd asked detailed questions about his logistics software and seemed genuinely impressed by his results. And he'd spent their entire conversation treating her like a sweet grandmother who was interested in his business struggles. With shaking hands, David picked up his phone and dialed the number on the business card. A professional receptionist answered immediately. Heritage Airlines Executive Offices, this is Patricia. How may I help you? I'd like to speak with Dorothy Heritage, please. This is David Thompson. One moment, Mr. Thompson. David expected to be transferred to voicemail or told that Ms. Heritage was unavailable. Instead, after just a few seconds, he heard Dorothy's familiar voice. David, I was hoping you'd call. How are you this morning? Honestly, I'm a bit shocked, David said. I just read your business card properly. Heritage Airlines? You own Heritage Airlines? Dorothy chuckled. I was wondering when you'd notice that. Yes, my husband started the company in 1967 with 2 small planes. We've grown a bit since then. David sat down heavily on his hotel bed. Heritage Airlines operated in 15 states with a fleet of over 100 aircraft. It wasn't one of the major national carriers, but it was a significant regional airline with millions of passengers every year. "Why didn't you tell me?" David asked. "Would it have changed how you treated me?" Dorothy asked gently. David thought about that question seriously. "Probably," he admitted. "I might have been more focused on trying to impress you instead of just having a genuine conversation." "Exactly. I meet a lot of people who act very differently once they know who I am. Yesterday, I got to see who you really are when you thought nothing was at stake. That's much more valuable than any business presentation." David's mind was spinning with the implications of this revelation. "Dorothy, I don't want you to think I helped you yesterday because I was hoping for something in return. I had no idea who you were." "I know that, David. That's exactly why your actions meant so much to me. In 40 years of business, I've learned to recognize genuine character when I see it. What you did yesterday showed me everything I need to know about the kind of person you are." David wasn't sure how to respond to that. He was still processing the fact that he'd spent an hour talking about business challenges with someone who probably understood those challenges better than almost anyone. "Can I ask you something?" Dorothy continued. "You mentioned yesterday that your software helps companies optimize their shipping and logistics. Does that include airlines?" "It could," David said carefully. "We've mostly worked with trucking, companies and retailers, but the principles are the same. Route optimization, cost analysis, efficiency tracking, those concepts apply to any transportation business." "Interesting. Heritage Airlines has been looking for ways to improve our operational efficiency. We've grown quickly over the past few years, and some of our systems haven't kept up. We're spending too much money on routes that don't make financial sense, and we don't have good visibility into where we're losing money." David felt his heart start racing. This was exactly the type of challenge his software was designed to solve. "I'd love to learn more about your specific challenges," David said. "If you're interested, I could put together a presentation that shows how our system could help Heritage Airlines." "I think that's an excellent idea," Dorothy said. "But I have a better suggestion. Why don't you come to Portland? I'll be here for the next few days taking care of my sister, and I could arrange for you to meet with our operations team. They could give you a detailed overview of our current challenges." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. The opportunity he'd thought he'd lost by missing his flight to Seattle was being replaced by something potentially even better. "I would be honored to do that," David said. "But I have to ask, is this because of what happened yesterday? Because I helped you at the airport?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment before answering. "David, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Heritage Airlines gets dozens of proposals from software companies every month. Most of them end up in the trash because they're either too expensive, too complicated, or from companies we don't trust." She paused, and David could hear her choosing her words carefully. "What happened yesterday told me 3 important things about you. First, you have good judgment. You recognized that helping someone in need was more important than your own immediate goals. Second, you have integrity. You made a significant personal sacrifice to help a stranger expecting nothing in return. And third, you understand that business is about people, not just profits." David felt overwhelmed by her words. "I appreciate that more than you know. But I want to make sure our software can actually help Heritage Airlines. I'm not interested in wasting your time or promising something I can't deliver." "That's exactly the kind of response I was hoping for," Dorothy said with obvious satisfaction. "Most people would have immediately started selling me on their product. You're more concerned about whether you can actually solve our problems." They spent the next 20 minutes discussing Heritage Airlines' specific operational challenges. Dorothy explained that their rapid growth had created inefficiencies in their route planning, fuel management, and crew scheduling. They were looking for an integrated solution that could help them optimize all of these areas. As David listened, he realized that his software could potentially save Heritage Airlines millions of dollars annually. This wasn't just about replacing the lost opportunity from yesterday. This could be bigger than anything his company had ever undertaken. "There's one more thing," Dorothy said as their call was winding down. "Heritage Airlines is always looking for strategic partners and board members who understand both technology and business ethics. If our working relationship goes well, there might be opportunities for a longer-term partnership. David felt like his head was spinning. 24 hours ago, he'd thought he'd destroyed his company's future by missing one flight. Now he was talking about a potential partnership with a major airline company. Dorothy, I have to ask, would any of this be happening if I hadn't helped you yesterday? Dorothy laughed. Probably not, but not for the reason you might think. It's not because I'm rewarding you for being kind to me. It's because helping me showed me that you're the type of person Heritage Airlines wants to do business with. We need partners who understand that success isn't just about maximizing profits. It's about building relationships and treating people with respect. After ending the call, David sat in his hotel room for a long time, staring at Dorothy's business card. His grandmother had always told him that character was more important than success, but he'd never imagined that character could actually lead to success in such a direct way. When he finally called Tony to explain what had happened, his business partner was speechless for almost a full minute. Let me get this straight, Tony finally said. You missed our biggest investor meeting to help an elderly woman with her luggage, and it turns out she owns an airline that wants to hire us? That's about the size of it, David said. David, Tony said slowly, remind me never to question your judgment again. 6 months later, Heritage Airlines had implemented David's logistics software across their entire operation, saving them over $8 million in the first year alone. David had been invited to join their board of directors, and his company had grown to over 60 employees. But the thing David treasured most was the friendship he'd developed with Dorothy. She'd become a mentor and advisor, and they spoke regularly about business, life, and the importance of never being too busy to help someone in need. Sometimes the flight you miss turns out to be the most important journey you never took.